Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Parenting is Easy Said No Never. I'm your host, Chananya Abraham, and an awesome conversation today with Jeff, who is the father of 3 children that have been enlisted within the Army and the Navy. And it's just a really cool story to hear about different things that he's been able to implement within his kids, having been a father to them for over 20 years between the 3 of them. And there are a few different topics that we covered that I felt were so important, and I'm so excited to share this with you. From teaching the concepts of personal courtesy and how to be courteous with other people, sustain confidence within self, grinding resilience within adversity itself is, I think, such an important topic of teaching resilience. So relax, sit back, and enjoy this episode. So Jeff, I know this is so exciting for me to actually, finally meet you in person and to have this conversation. And there are so many areas that I want to get to, and hopefully we can stay as structured and I don't get a little too giddy over here. But really just to get us, started off over here. I think the concept of being a parent for a child that's in the Army, that's away from home, but at the same time, there's a certain pride when it comes to serving country. I'm curious if you could just talk about that a little bit, for what that's like for you, and what message would you give to parents that are sending their kids off to the Army, to the Navy for the first time?
Certainly. You mentioned my kid who's in the Army. He was the West Point grad. My 2 elder sons are in the Navy. One went to the Naval Academy. The other went to a small school in New England, Williams College, and then went to OCS right after that. So, when you have 3 kids in the service, normally like you alluded to, the question is, how did they get there? And the reason for the service is pretty much kind of a validation of the book that I sent you, 4 Lessons from My 3 Sons, in raising them in a certain way that the qualities that are demanded of the service, and perhaps, other jobs too, other serious jobs, seem to find a complement in the people, men and women, that my sons wanted to be around. And yes, for parents who have kids in the service, and I just talked to a mom last night whose kid is an Army captain taking a company of soldiers, an armored company, Bradley vehicles and Abrams tanks, to Poland for a whole year. And, that's a huge separation. And the animating, I think, emotion that any of us who are military parents have is, this is exactly where you want your kid. You want your kid to have enormous responsibility, in charge of the lives and the careers of, from 35 to 150, and you have that great satisfaction that your kid is built for this, and that he or she can perform at a high level. And and the reason they're performing at that high level is because so many years of good parenting, and sometimes parenting is included talking with guys like you, in an office, to achieve a kid that has this tremendous sense of responsibility and can follow through and actually do the job.
So I love the way you're saying, like, regarding that parenting aspect of things, but not the perfect parenting, because there is no such thing, and we're going to mess up sometimes. No. And there are going to be things that sort of, I don't want to say get in the way, but I guess you could say is a part of the process, when it comes to being a parent. And I know that in your book specifically, you talk about the concepts and specific ones, and I want to go through them one by one that I think are really important. And I'm curious, talking about them, but also how you've been able to apply them to being a dad of these 3 wonderful boys, and the concept of personal courtesy. And we'll start off with that. And I'm curious in general how parents can effectively teach personal courtesy to their children in a world that sometimes, has a lot more self-interest, so to speak, over kindness. And how is that something that, that we can work on at home?
I love the way you put it. The self-obsession of the age, that's overwhelming. And of course, all of it emanates from the glowing rectangle, from this thing.
The phone.
When you're the iPhone, the iPad, the laptop, even the computer monitor, the TV, all of that self-obsession emanates from that. And when you've got an average kid between the age of 10 and 18 spending 8 hours and 47 minutes a day on a screen, which doesn't include schoolwork, you have that self-obsession you talk about. Hence, to build that personal courtesy, the first thing is you got to get that kid off the phone. And when my kids were young, that was it was easier than it is today for parents. But even at that time, they didn't get phones until they were at the end of 11th grade. And that's dramatic. But of course, we're talking about my 3 kids as military officers. Yeah, the dramatic sometimes works. The idea of personal courtesy, it goes back to a theme that's throughout the book. Parents have to have a strategy for raising their kids. And maybe you talk about this when you talk with your clients, but our job as parents is not just to focus on building a relationship with our kids. Our real job is to teach our kids to build a relationship with the world outside. That is all the people, the relationship, the challenges, the obstacles, the successes, everything that's beyond the front door. Because by the time a kid is age 12, that parent has spent 75% of the time they're going to spend with that kid. And so after 12 years old, you get 25% of that kid's time, and that kid remains and thrives or fails in that real world. And that's only 25% of the time you're going to spend with them. Courtesy was always a hallmark. And the only way you can develop courtesy is in that real world I spoke about, is pointing out the examples of the good and the bad and the inspirational. And so when you're out and about with your kids, you point out the good examples. There's a guy opening a door for a senior, or there's a parent engaging shy parents in conversations. Then you see a kid being a jerk to his parents. You're at an event and the parents are, holding all the gear and the kid's walking ahead of him 10 feet texting on his phone. And you say, that's a jackass. And you don't want to be like that. And yeah, that's harsh, but the world is harsh. We just talked about that earlier. And that's how you build that courtesy. That's how you build that personal responsibility and accountability. You point out the good and the bad, and you just sear it in your kid's mind that there's certain ways that they shouldn't act.
Yeah, I think that you're touching on so many amazing points over here. I think like the biggest thing that I'm taking away from what you're saying, I love the phrase of the good, the bad, and the inspirational. I'm old enough, even though I wasn't around when it came out, but you remember the Clint Eastwood movie of the good, the bad, and the ugly. But I think when you point out the good, the bad, and the inspirational, when you try to emulate and show by example of the things that are good and are bad and that we can do better at, it's sort of like a coach looking at film with his team, and you're looking for the good and you're looking for the things that need to be better at. And when we point it out to our kids, that's one of the best things that we can do. It's like it's having replay but in real life, and it's allowing us to show by example for the different things that we're able to show our kids. So I think that's a great strategy that could be so beneficial for us as parents. I'm curious if there's anything else that could, let's say, help show empathy and respect to our kids in a way that with interacting with others, or maybe by examples for ourselves, that you would recommend.
Yeah, and just quickly, I love the idea of watching the film and seeing the good and the bad, because my kids, over the course of their careers, and they were pretty good athletes, both in high school and college, they watched hours and hours and days and weeks of film of opposing teams and of their own performance on a field. So that's a great analogy. I think that again, this is it's probably self-evident, but you model the behavior. And so when you said empathy and respect for your kids, you model behavior, and when you don't, you tell your kids you haven't. And in the book, Four Lessons for My Three Sons, there's plenty of times that I take shots at myself where I didn't meet the mark and it was evident. And I said to my kids, Dad's wrong on this, and you're right. I remember bugging my kid, my eldest, about running for a student body government office in high school. And I kept nagging him. I said, you're good on your feet. You got a lot of friends. You're well spoken. You really got to run for this office. And I kept nagging and nagging, and he would demur. And finally, one day, I was nagging him about it, and he looked at me and he said, Dad, I know what I'm doing here. And my jaw dropped, and I thought, you're right, and I'm wrong on this, and I'm never going to bring it up again. So that idea of modeling it, the good stuff, but also, the idea that, wow, I don't have all the answers, and I'm never going to have all the answers.
Yeah, that's such a good point. This last point of I think sometimes the best words we can say to our kid, the best three words we can say to our kids is, I don't know. And that's okay.
Right.
If anything, I can make an argument that by us saying those words, I don't know, makes us more trustworthy to them for the future. That we're not a Google machine, and we're a human being.
Right.
And sometimes the answer is, I don't know. Let me find out for you for that. And it becomes like, oh, okay, so he doesn't know everything, but maybe that means the things that I will ask him, he will give advice on, he will help me with. I mean, he actually knows on that topic. And I think that's a very, very good point. And you remind me of I think one of the most profound stories that I've ever heard, or at least I've been involved in. I think I've mentioned it here on the podcast, but I still think it's worth mentioning over here a little bit before we move on to lesson number 2, which I think is a really, really important one. But I was listening to a lecture and people talking about putting a pause on their personal / family life to continue their career. And they were talking, it was a Q&A session with a bunch of different professors. And someone asking a simple question of, why would I want to pursue a family and have kids and have a marriage when, right now, shouldn't I be working and focusing on my career? Shouldn't I be putting myself in a place where I'm becoming more advanced and, I can have a healthy bank account, and I have, the insurance, living on my own, maybe even have a house already before I try to settle down, just so that I'll be more advanced when it comes to being a parent. And one of the professors was very, very quick to respond to saying, yes, I understand what you're saying, but you're missing one very, very big point over here. He said, one of the best things you can do as a parent, and this is not for everyone, and it's not for everyone to say that you should get married at a very young age either, just, so everyone listening to sort of just understand what we're talking about over here. But the concept that the professor was trying to answer back was to tell him, one of the things that you can do as a parent when you're younger is for your child to see you struggle. It's for your child to see the growing pains that you're going through. So when you're trying to juggle building up your career or that small business or that mom and pop store, and at the same time you're also trying to be a parent, and you're also trying to fix that leaky sink, and you're also trying to rake the leaves, and you want to get some sleep, and it's Saturday morning, all those things happening at once, and your kids seeing all you doing all those things, it's one of the best parenting things you can possibly do, because you're in a place where they're watching dad go through life and go through things on a daily basis. And that's such a beautiful answer. And I really, really appreciate listening to that, of the concept. Again, not for everyone. And I'm not to say everyone here should get married in their late teens, early 20s. And, that's what should be for everyone. But I think the concept of a child watching a parent struggle through life, because life is adversity. And that's a part of what we are supposed to be about. And I think it's such an important lesson. And I love the way you're saying that. It's a really, really good point over here. And I think to that point, go ahead.
You're so right, because, that's one of the themes too in the book. No one gets a free ride. And, everyone hits the obstacles, and they hit the wall and the setbacks. And the best thing for an adult, but mostly, specifically for a kid, remember, by 12, at 75% of the time you're going to spend with them, is to hit that wall and to somehow find a way around it or over it. That's the whole resilience factor. And indeed, that's why resilience is in the title of the book. The kid that can consistently hit the wall in the setback and get around it or over it, is the kid is set up later on in life to handle the adversity, your word, handle the adversity and move on. And the kid who it does not, hits the setback is enabled by the parent for some reason, um, is never going to be able to stand on their own 2 feet. And to pick up what you just said, the kid seeing the parent go through trials and get over them, that's that's perfect. That's
Yeah.
magical, because
Yes.
that kid then gets that muscle memory that the old man got around it. I can do it too.
Right. So I just want to, I personally, I would change a little bit of the wording that you said. It's not moving on from, but it's moving with, and it's taking that
Oh yeah,
adversity
right.
that you've had and moving with it. So yeah, so there was a failure in a certain place. Okay, so how can we work with this? The example that I talk about is, I'm forgetting his name right now, but it's I know he's been knighted now, but Dyson, Mr. Dyson himself, that from the Dyson vacuum cleaner. There's been a lot of reports and some great articles talking about of how many prototypes he went through until he
Yeah.
actually got the working Dyson vacuum cleaner, and it's over 5,000 different
Oh my.
failures where he had to get to the point
Oh,
where he has the most famous vacuum cleaner the world has ever seen. And there's a reason why he's knighted. The reason why he's a billionaire is because of the failures and because of what he's been through, which is such a great point over here. And to using your words over here, I think I like the way you say it of grinding resilience in adversity. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about how parents can encourage a healthy relationship with failure and setbacks and promoting that resilience rather than defeat.
yeah. I mean, that's grinding resilience in adversity. It sounds like the name of a heavy metal band or something, but it it was always the the theme that I pounded home to these guys. In fact, I'm so counterintuitive, and maybe a lot of your clients would say I'm a bad dad. I loved seeing my kids in a tight situation. I liked seeing them hit a wall and decide, okay, now what do I do? And I devoted a whole chapter of that into the book. And the only way you can build that resilience is to watch your kids fail and give them hints on how they can get around it or with it, like you say, or over it, and let them do it themselves. And you don't ever pick up a kid. Kid's got to get to his feet or her feet on their own, because it's the best lesson for the next time it happens, which might be tomorrow or next week or next month. And the examples I use in the book, they all happened. We we were once at a field. Every Sunday we'd go to a field with a bunch of other parents and kids and throw football around and lacrosse balls and soccer balls, and it's just a big fun fest. And at the end of it, I would tell the guys, "Okay, go long. Dad's going to throw a rainbow downfield, and you're going to catch it, and then we'll go get donuts." And I'm in the midst of reeling back, my Tom Brady fashion, and my kid says to me, "Dad, we can't go get donuts. You just got fired from your job." And he was right. I had just been on the south side of an election, and when your candidate loses, you're gone. And I looked at him as the pass is sailing downfield, and I looked at him. And I said, "Yeah, man, in this very sardonic way, it's the end of the world." And I said, "Okay, guys, we're going to have a seat in my office here on the 50-yard line." I sat him down and I said, "Yep, I lost the job. I'm unemployed. I'm scrambling to get a new job. But don't worry, it's all going to work out. I have you guys to keep me company. Got to work on my throwing arm, and it's all going to be fine." And that phrase, it's the end of the world, just became this almost, reverse humorous phrase for them to use anytime they were in a scene. If they spilled a gallon of milk on the kitchen floor, it's the end of the world. If they're pulling back a D in a class, yeah, it's the end of the world. Or they get benched or whatever. It gave them that kind of saving face idea that, hell, if dad can get over getting fired from a job, this is not that big of a deal. and I can move on and, like you say, take it with me and reverse it somehow, some way.
I love it.
And that's the kind of non-drama that it's great to have with kids, because then they become just kind of good-natured, able to absorb the blows, and at the same time kind of keep that fixed eye, that grinding resilience on the future, whether it's the next day or the next week. And instead of, you know, enabling them, helicopter parenting them, rescuing them out of anything that they get into, letting them take the pain like they saw the old man take the pain and endure. I love this phrase. My old drill sergeant in the Army once said to us, a whole battalion of guys are sitting there, and he goes, "Your only job is to assess, adapt, and advance." And I thought, there I am at Fort Benning at infantry school, and I thought, that's the best advice anyone's ever going to hear in their entire life. So that's kind of behind, that chapter of the book, and the reaction to adversity.
That's great. I love it. I love how you take in the phrase, the end of the world, which unfortunately became a very popular song in a certain way. But at the same time, you're using it
Yeah,
as like a springboard for life, and like you can go through
right.
something, and yeah, okay, it's the end of the world, and like okay, spring. Let's continue going over here. And I think when it comes to adversity, one of the I guess for me, what I would say is a springboard for that concept of getting through it is when a person is able to have purpose and meaning within self. And we're not going to get into a whole discussion
Yeah.
of how and what that means and how we can go about it. But I'm curious if you could discuss the regarding the importance of fostering that concept of purpose and meaning in children as a foundation for that resilience that you're talking about.
Yeah, and I like that purpose and meaning, because and maybe those are better terms than I use in the book, which was just confidence. Confidence in everyday life, confidence in yourself, confidence in your surroundings and environment. Building that confidence was key, and the only way you can build confidence in a kid, and this is crazy old man dad here. The only way you can do that is you give them tests. And every time you give a kid a test, the confidence increase. For example, I use the example in the book. We're in the indoor mall, and I decide this is the time to begin this. And the eldest is 7.5. The youngest is 4. And I pull out from my wallet 3 $5 bills, and I hand one to each kid, and I say, "Go get the old man change. This is not a race. This is not, some frenzy. Just go into the stores around here. I'll keep an eye on you and bring back change." And of course, they're delighted. This is a task. Has the element of excitement in it. And of course, they trudge off, and one kid strikes out twice, and another kid comes back with 20 quarters in his pocket. But they all come back, and the test has been completed, and they're successful. And we played that game numerous times. And then, of course, we elevated it. We'd be at a restaurant, and I'd point to the 6-year-old and say, "You memorize all our orders and then give them to the waiter or waitress when they come to take the order." And then we're in an airport, and I hand a kid all the paperwork, and I say, "Go get 5 boarding passes." And so it kept magnifying itself. But every time the kid performed the task and relatively succeeded, that confidence was built, that purpose and meaning, your terms, in that, I have this purpose in my life because I've already achieved all these other things on my own in a strange environment, surrounded by strangers. And so I feel pretty good about myself. And that confidence, of course, just accelerates and accelerates. And soon, your sons are 3-sport captains, and then they're in charge of 45 guys on a guided missile destroyer, in an engine room that has $1 billion worth of engines in it. That confidence to be able to lead or to take orders. And it all starts when they're young, when they start to take these small tasks and succeed in them.
That's amazing. That's amazing. And I know we've shifted from, I guess you could say, area number two of that grinding resilience and diversity into this conversation regarding confidence. And I love these examples, and I can relate to them. And my dad doing stuff a little bit similar of having to place orders, pick up the phone, and call customer
Right.
service and and stuff like that. Which obviously today's day is a little bit different of how things are, how we would go about things. And I could take my daughter to the self-service kiosk in the airport and have her do all that information, which is in a way similar.
Right.
Obviously, not the same if you're face to face
Yes.
with a human being, but it does suffice as a level of confidence in that sense of doing things for herself. And I think our job as parents, as much as we would love to have our kids live with us all the time, well, most of the time, I think there's a certain point that we want to be able to have a adult that is mature and has confidence and knows how to deal with adversity and have ambition within themselves, that they're going to be the best human beings possible when they're outside of this of our little cocoon or that home on
Right.
123 Main Street. And I think that's something that we foster within them. And I think what you're talking about, and I think these topics and those little examples go such a long way. And I'm so confident that if I spoke to your three sons and I would ask them to recall, being in the mall and having to go to do that, we would hear some really cool stories about what was going through their head and how they went about doing that. And we're hearing it from you, from your point of view, from the dad's point of view, and it's just, I think it's something that is so helpful for how we can go about building that level of confidence. But I'm curious, what's that balance when it comes to nurturing
Yeah.
that child's self confidence, but ensuring that they also remain humble and empathetic when it comes to how they're going to deal with other people and other situations?
Boy, I've never been asked that question. I mean, wow. Uh, I mean, my kids developed this, and of course, their mom, my ex, deserves 90% of the credit for how they turned out, because she's just a magnificent, leader herself. I don't. They never. I mean, they were leaders, but more than that, they were just pretty easygoing, loose guys. In the book, you'll notice there's a ton of humor, because I don't believe platitudes with adults don't work, and they sure as hell don't work with kids. And so a lot of the advice or guidance was always couched in some kind of humorous fashion. So they never really took themselves too seriously when they were out and about with their peers. But I don't know. That's a question I don't have an answer for.
So
That
I want to be honest with you. I got to say, I think you gave the answer, and I want to explain what I mean. You mentioned of you and your wife being divorced, and I think it's something that the way you talk about her, but yet you can still have a certain level of admiration for who she was as a mom to the kids. And there are separations that happen in life, and I think it's a part of life in a lot of
yeah,
relationships, and that's okay. And it's not doesn't have to be something that's sour, doesn't have to be something that is
well,
negative, and you can still look at her and have the appreciation for who she was for them, maybe for you as well. And I think that's the part that makes a person humble. That in itself, when you're able to have something that's not there but yet still appreciate who that person is, that is the answer. That's the actual answer, Jeff. That's what it is. And I think that's where kids
yeah,
are able to go ahead and learn and see that. Or that's the best example that a child can have, that when they can see those levels of confidence and also being humble at the same time. And they're able, the way I like saying it, in my office, they're able to be on the couch at the same time. I know it's a very cliche answer to give
yeah,
as a therapist, but I think you're able to have that concept of the self confidence and getting change, but yet at the same time staying humble and appreciating things, even though they may not be what they were 20, 30 years ago, but today they could be in a place where, what, I still have a lot of appreciation for them. And I think it's something that I think if all kids that grew up in a divorced home, if they had that type of parent that's still able to have that appreciation, I think we'd have a lot more humble kids today, in today's day and age. And I think that's a really, really wonderful trait. And just, to wrap up this part of what we talk about regarding the confidence over here. And you gave some very actionable tips over here. But I'm curious just a little bit more just regarding like building that confidence. Let's say if you give one example, let's say regarding out of school, and let's say one example in school regarding their scholastic capabilities and also dealing with teachers and stuff and building the confidence, what would be an example or two that you can think of regarding the school aspect of confidence for kids and maybe out of school aspect of building up confidence in kids? An example that maybe you've dealt with your kids or something that you can think of that you can share with our listeners here.
Sure. And, here's one for you. I think, and maybe this goes back to the Old Testament. To me, humility is power under control. And maybe and I would say that to the kids, yeah, you're team captain and, you're doing pretty well in school, but man, guess what? There are a million kids in this country that are doing that kind of stuff. So just, you know how to act, and they got it. In terms of in school, once they went to an all boys school when they were younger, and their sister school was having a theater production called Pirates of Penzance. And I said to him, "Oh, this is great." And the sister school needed pirates for the production, and they came to the boys' school. And I said, "Oh, this is great. You need to do this." And they said, "No, we're not going to do it." And I said, "Look, this will look great on your record, that you did this." And they go, "No, no, no." And I said, "Well, hey, man, being on a theater stage," I said, you play lacrosse in front of 200 people. And 100 of them are rooting for you to fail. That is the opponent's parents. And, this is the real world of, high-end lacrosse athletics in the Washington, D.C. area. And they say, no, 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 no. And I said, okay, finally, I said, look, I'll give you $10 a piece if you just go to the dang rehearsal. And if you don't like it, I'll be waiting outside. And you can just come on out. And so I dropped them off that Saturday with the $10 in their pockets each, and they walked in, and I drove away. And I came back 2 hours later, and they came out, and, they had their pirate bandana on and these tunics made of burlap and these plastic swords, and they just, pulled up, they got in the car, and I said, "Oh, I'm glad I didn't wait. And, I didn't wait for you guys." And the eldest kid says, "Dad, we knew you'd left. We knew you'd leave. You were giving us this test, and we knew we had to follow through on it, and we knew we could, and so we did it." Now, that's the confidence of a kid, in an kind of an academic, scholastic school setting.
Oh, yeah.
That, yeah, we know you're going to leave. We know we can get through this, Yeah, we didn't want to do it, but, long term, it's just not going to hurt. It's no big deal.
Yeah.
That's the kind of confidence that they had. We knew you'd left,
I love it. I love that. And it's great that your kids, like, I guess I could say they can call your bluff with staying, and yet they still went through with it. And that's the confidence, I think, that we're talking about here. So, okay. So,
yeah.
we talked about this, the personal courtesy a little bit. We talked about, this sustained confidence, and as well as, grinding resilience and adversity. And I think one other big topic that, I think you're very big on, and I think it shines in the book as well. We talk about a steady ambition and having that that ambitious nature, which the way I look at ambition, and the example that I always think of, and I know I've talked about here on the podcast, is the baseball player Ricky Henderson was asked once, like,
sure,
how does
Oakland A's?
Yes, well, I'm a Mets fan, so I'm thinking the Mets, but you're probably right.
Of course, right. He got traded, yeah.
Yeah, he's probably more of an Oakland A than he is a Met anyway, but. I think in general, the concept that he would talk about when asked, like, what's his mindset when he's stealing a base? And I'm paraphrasing. I don't remember the exact phrase that he said. Where he says, "I never look at the base. I always look at the spot right behind the base." so that when I'm running to the base, I'm running at full speed. And that's not my end. My end is really after the base.
Right.
So when he's running to first base, it's not just 90 feet. He's looking at the 91st foot, which I think is such a great way of thinking about it. And I know that's the Mamba mentality when it came to Kobe Bryant as well, when he talks about, the concept of, if your goal is to lose 15 pounds, well, aim for 18 so that you lose the 15 for sure. And I think that's what
Right.
I think about when it comes to ambition aspect of things. And I'm curious if you can, define it from your point of view as a parent and how you look at it. And what would be like an example to how parents can support their children's ambitions that they have, but at the same time having a healthy balance when it comes to, their work / school, scholastic life that they have within themselves.
Sure. The best example I can give is, I wasn't banging on them every day that they got to get straight A's, that they've got to be starting on a team, and that they have to be, president of the student body. I think the whole thing started to coalesce, and it had beforehand, but one morning we were at a very high-end prep school here in the Atlantic, and it was early. We were early for the game because the Nelligans were always early for everything. And we were driving down the main drag of the school, and there's all these posters up, justice, inclusion, diversity. And we're driving down this, and we're all looking at the banners. And I said to my kid, I said, yeah, SATs, GPA, all conference. And he starts laughing. This is a 9-year-old kid, and he starts laughing. And I said, you get it, man. I said, look, those are all, your dad's all in on all those things. But in the real world, what counts is performance. It's not how you think, it's what you do. And I said, we're going to be in this tournament in about, an hour, and every kid out there is going to be judged by how hard they hit and how well they throw and how much endurance they have in the fourth quarter. And they're going to be judged on that, not because they want to save the SEALs or they're woke. It's all performance, and that's how your coaches and your teachers and your parents and your peers judge you. And I said, and he got it. He understood. He says, yeah. He says, we've got to beat St. Paul's today. And I said, yeah, that's it. I don't care how you think about anything. The virtue signaling, that doesn't mean anything. It's how you perform. And that's the way all three kids approached life, was just, the nitty gritty. How are you doing every day? What, are you moving the chains downfield? And I think that became, just part of their mantra, that they knew they weren't, that it all came down to what they did every day and how they advanced those chains, how they moved the chains instead of throwing some long bomb in the end zone.
I like that.
And the other part of the ambition,
that's great.
And I think today kids, we really haven't talked about the state of kids today. You probably know better than I do because they're coming in and out of your office every day with their parents, and they've got just this multitude of anxieties or uncertainties. My kids maybe weren't that smart. They didn't have too many of those. And so we were lucky. But the kids today, I always hear, and I bet you hear in your practice all the time, my kid's really smart. My kid, tests off the charts. And I hear this from parents all the time, and they're sincere and they're proud. And I say, smart's overrated. I said, we live in the most educated and the wealthiest country in the history of mankind. So I don't want to hear how smart a kid is. I want to hear about a kid who can follow through on a task. Just get something done. And that comes to the idea that, kids today maybe perhaps don't have that engine in them to do those things. And then they become a little bit, and you said this at the beginning of the program, they become enveloped in self-obsession and then self-pity. And once, that's bad juju. And as I say, you probably see it all the time. The other thing about ambition is, and I said this earlier, I take a lot of shots at myself in the book. One of the things we would do driving around the DC area is we'd pass all these massive office buildings, 20, 30 stories, steel and brick and concrete, just soulless places, and all these office parks full of the same kind of buildings, maybe smaller. And we'd be driving around them. And finally, one day I said, "Hey, guys, I want to make a point here," because we'd always comment on them. I said, in that building right there on the 7th floor, some guy's sitting there at a desk with a computer screen in front of him, and he's got a picture of his family on the wall and a coffee mug like the one you made me in 2nd grade. And he's sitting there, and he was going to be a jet pilot, or he was going to own a bunch of real estate, or he was going to sail around the world, or he was going to be an IT genius. And instead, he's sitting at that desk, guys, and he's looking at the computer screen. And he's going, "What in the hell am I doing here? I was going to be somebody, and here I am." And I said, "That guy's your dad. So you have got to get farther than your dad." And of course, that hit like a damn lightning bolt. But they've never forgotten that story. And I sure haven't.
Yeah.
But that's the other thing about the idea of using yourself as an example, even if it's in an unflattering light.
No, I love that. That's such a great point, and I think the example of giving, at the end, just the punchline of the story is, "Oh yeah, that's your dad." I was like, whoa, that's like
dad.
that really hits home. And I'm curious, as we sort of like start wrapping it up over here, just on this concept of the ambition. When you see a kid that's veering into unhealthy territory, ambitions, and things that they're trying to pursue, and I think there is a point of having that agency to pick a way of life that they want to live, as long as it has that meaning and purpose that we've been talking about. But as a kid, if they're going to a place where it's unhealthy territory regarding their ambition, how can parents like intervene in a constructive manner?
Wow. I mean, maybe you see that in your practice. Do you mean a kid that is, let's say, 15 or 25? I mean, does your
So let's
does your
start with
practice
that.
go up to
Let's start
older,
with that, like
younger adults?
that the teenager, that teenager that is, their ambitions, I guess you could say, are not set up in a way where it's going to be beneficial for them growing up. Now, I mean, I'm what I mean very specifically, and I say the words for that child, because a lot of times as parents, we might think what we might want for our kid, and it's not necessarily going to be the right thing for that child. And we have to be careful to know that what am I pushing? Am I pushing my agenda, or am I pushing their agenda? And I think sometimes, as parents, we have this thing, well, since they're very good at guitar, they should continue playing the instrument. And it could be they hate the guitar. They just have to be good at it. And we have to be careful to know that whatever it is that we're trying to help them with, they also like, and they have a passion for, and they have a ambition for. But sometimes there are kids that can be doing certain things. Let's again give an example without getting too far into it over here. But let's pick an example of let's say playing running back on a football team, which, as studies have shown, it could be something that right now a lot of players have come out to say that they wouldn't let their kids play because of how much force and contact there can be, and the long term I don't want to say catastrophic, but like the long-term effects
Sure.
that it can have on a child's brain. So if a child is doing something that, they are ambitious about, they are passionate about, but it's not necessarily the most healthiest thing, how can a parent go about helping to veer them onto a path that can be better for them?
Boy, that's the toughest question there is, because you're not talking about, I'll be candid here. You're not talking about drug addicts or people hanging around bad kids. I mean, you're talking about kids who are pursuing something like the guitar. I mean, come on, or running back. My kids were running backs, among other things. Boy, a parent stepping in has got to do it with, shock treatment's not going to do it. A parent stepping in to say, look, at some point, where are you going to take the guitar? I mean, sometimes when my kids would come to me with these, unusual things, I would say, well, let's just walk this out about a year, man. Or let's walk it out about 5 years. Do you really think you're going to be, uh, an outside linebacker in a Division I college? I said, man, I'm telling you, you're not. And your dad loves you and everything. And I've been at every damn game and every practice you've ever had. But that's not where you're headed. Um, so let's just think about that. So you can't bring the hammer down on them and saying, look, you're never going to play outside linebacker again or running back, or you're going to play the guitar. I think you just have to appeal to the kid's better conscience or wisdom to say, look, that's great. You want to play guitar, but you know what? You don't have it. You don't have what it takes. And you don't want to be, this is what I always tell. You don't want to be 30 years old and your kid's playing guitar in a cover band in, New Haven on Saturday nights. And they have no visible means of support other than that. So it's got to be the subtle move rather than just, like I say, bringing the hammer down.
You're bringing up a very, very good point, and I'm so happy that you're saying it this way, because I think our job as parents is sometimes, the truth can hurt sometimes, and I think when
Oh
we're
yeah.
able to have those tough conversations, and the tough conversation doesn't just have to be about drugs and the birds and the bees.
Right.
The
Right.
tough conversations, I think, also shows that the real love that we have for our kids are
Oh
having
yeah.
those tough conversations. And the fact that I'm telling you that you're not going to be a outside linebacker in a Division I school, I'm not saying that to burst your bubble. I'm saying that because I love you. And I think that
Oh yeah.
is something that when that message is given over, and we have to know how to give it over to our kids. And I wouldn't be surprised if you had to have that conversation with all three of your boys in three different mannerisms, just because of they're just a little bit different, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. And I think us as
Yeah.
parents, our job is to make sure that when we have those conversations, they know that what we're trying to say to them is that we love them, and that's why we're saying it. They could be upset. They might be pissed off at us in the moment, but what we're
Yeah.
doing is we're showing them that I love you, and therefore I'm saying that. And I think that is something that can help put the ambition for whatever it is that they're wanting to succeed at. And it could be their ambition is to succeed in whatever it is that they're doing. And I think that is
Also,
something,
I,
by having what you're saying specifically, of having that conversation, those tough conversations, that itself is so important, and is such a vital point in healthy parenting.
yeah, and I have to tell you, I did have that conversation once. I was kind of going back through my mind. I'm an old man. Remembering all these three kids and all their escapades over the years. When my kid was in 10th grade, my eldest, beginning of 10th grade, he said, Dad, we were driving home from something, and he says, I think I know what I want to be. I want to become a teacher. And because, I and it was obvious because he was around teachers. He was at a private school. The teachers were great. The coaches were great. He wanted to become a teacher and a coach. And he'd been in this academic environment. Many of the family members were teachers, including, you know, at least half a dozen.
Oh wow.
And I didn't say, oh, that's stupid. But I realized that I didn't want that kind of to take hold. So, and I wrote about this in the book. And in fact, in the book, I took the most flack I've ever taken for anything in my life, including on NPR, on National Public Radio when I was interviewed about the book. So I said, that's great. And then I waited until all four of us were in the car and we were coming home from, a game. And I said, hey, we're going to take a little detour here. And I took them, drove 30 miles to a neighborhood at the other end of our county that was, let's call it lower income neighborhood, and the cars are parked in the front yards and the homes are kind of debilitated and there's debris everywhere and kids toys and they so I started driving down a few of the streets and we had the windows rolled up and they were whispering, there were some guys loitering around with beer cans smoking cigs and they go, Dad, what are we doing here? And I said, well, and then the eldest said, Dad, why are you taking us here? And they were visibly upset. And I said, well, I'll tell you, because if you want to become a teacher, you'll be lucky to rent one of these places. And they were in shock. I said, "You are used to an acre of land and a big home and everything you want and virtually everything you need, neighbors and peers in a private school, and these wonderful opportunities. And dad and mom work like crazy to make this happen for you." And I said, if you become a teacher, this is going to be your way of life because teachers don't make that much money. They're the most valuable members of our society, and they are treated terribly poorly. And I said, that's what you have to look forward to. And they were in shock. And I drove them around another 25 minutes. And then we went home, and actually we went to a birthday party for a buddy of mine who lived on the Chesapeake Bay. They're peers of my sons from school. Now, the reason I did that was, and that's the kind of the hammer I talked about earlier, is because he had no concept of what was going to happen if he became a teacher. An average teacher's salary is about $67,000 a year, and it doesn't get much better over the course of time. You are in charge of a room of 30 kids, half of whom are on their cell phones, and half of whom are getting free breakfast and lunch at school. He had no idea what his life was going to be like if he chose that route. And I didn't know any other way, in my very ham-fisted, primitive way of showing him that that was the future. And about 2 or 3 weeks later, he said, "Dad," we're driving somewhere. He said, "Dad, I'm going to become like Mr. Sitzman." Sitzman was a teacher at the school he went to who'd made a fortune in the sailcloth industry and then had retired to become a history teacher. Beloved man, super guy. But he said, "I think I'm going to go that route." And it never came up again. So maybe that's not the great way to put it for you, who has to deal with maybe more tender and sensitive parents. That's the way I dealt with it. And I took hell for that for years.
Yeah,
From
I can see that.
Mom.
That makes a lot of sense why you would take help for that, and I can see why not just NPR, any place that you would get. I have to think about it. I have to process it. I wouldn't say that I would do the same thing with my kids if that's the way they came to me of being a teacher, and I'm not gonna comment on it enough to say right or wrong. I have to really think about it the right way to go about it, because I think what you were doing was bringing a sort of hands-on, tangible type lesson for what it is that what their future is going to look like, and that's not always the case. So there are so many other ways I think that that could be good, and I think one of the things we talk about here on the podcast is that there is no right way to do things. It's more like doing it the way that you need for your child, and I think based on the way our talk went today, it was very, very, very on par with how you've gone about parenting, and how you brought up your kids. And I'm sure that's something that really, is evident throughout the entire book. So, I understand why you did that. I'm not sure if I agree or disagree. I'm gonna have to think about it a little bit.
I know.
And
that's the thing.
And that's okay, right? There's nothing wrong with that.
Right.
Of me saying that, or anyone having an opinion to you. And I think that's something that, I'm sure your kids, if we ask them that question regarding what was that day like before the birthday party, and what was it like for you going through that part of town, what was that like for you? And I'm sure we'd get some very, very interesting feedback regarding how you went about that.
No question. And I know that it sounds very harsh, but that was you. I guess it's kind of enveloped in all the way people think about parenting today. Instead of saying, "Well, I think that's a great endeavor and you should continue doing it, and when you get out of this school, you can go and take on 60 or 70K worth of debt, and then you can become a teacher and get your credential, and then you'll be in inner city Baltimore teaching these kids, and then you'll be 30, and then you'll go, what the hell am I doing here?"
Yeah.
And
right.
it was a very, very harsh and, rock solid approach. But what's the alternative? And I think all parents, like you just said it, there's a right way for everybody. Well, that was the right way for me. And other parents may disagree until their kid's 30. in that inner city school and they're going, oh no.
Right. I 100% understand that. But I think nowadays also, with being a teacher, there's so many, side hustles that people can do and I'm not saying everyone should be going ahead and creating content online, but, with the expertise of someone being a
Yeah,
teacher, there are so many things that could be done today. That's not just about that, 8 to 2 job that you would have being a teacher, which is a
right.
very admirable profession to have,
Oh,
like
it's
you
the
were
best.
saying, so
Teachers,
there are so many more
yeah.
things that could be done. And I understand it, and I do respect it. Again, I'm not sure if I agree with it. I have to think about it, but I think that's something that I think it makes perfect sense for what you're saying and how you went about doing things here. As we sort of wrap things up over here, and I'm curious if there was
Sure.
any just a few rapid fire questions over here, and I'm curious based on so many different concepts that you've talked about, and we touched on the 4 main things that you talk about in general. Was there any book, or is there a book that you would recommend people read other than your own, or maybe either YouTube channel, or maybe a person that a person can listen to a podcast that where they can get more parenting or guidance information from that has been beneficial to you that you would like to recommend?
Number one book. In fact, I would urge your listeners and your clients when you talk to them to buy this book before they buy mine. It's called Anxious Generation by Dr. Jonathan Haidt. It came out 5 weeks ago.
Yep.
It's the most important book about parenting and child raising and children that I think has ever been written. And I've been doing this stuff for, 25 years.
Yeah.
Anxious Generation, Jonathan Haidt.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for talking about that. We haven't got a chance to process that book yet on this channel, but I'm almost done with it, and it's an absolute amazing book. Huge fan of him and
Oh,
his
yeah.
books and his work that he's done. And we'll try to post a link for that in our show notes over here. 2 more questions over here. I'm curious if you could think about someone in history that you would be comfortable to babysit your kids. That's not a family member. Who would that be?
Winston Churchill,
Mm. And why is that?
G.K. Chesterton,
Okay.
and Judge Smales from Caddyshack.
Okay. Amazing. Love it. If you can think of a everyday / mundane superpower that you would like to have as a dad, what would that be?
Discernment. Discernment. That goes back to Solomon asking about what's the one thing you want. God
Mm,
asks him, this is in
right.
Kings,
Right.
and he says, what's the one thing that you want? And he said, I want discernment to understand these people that you've given me. I think discernment, insight, vision, that would be the ultimate superpower.
Amazing. Wow. This has been absolutely amazing. Jeff, I'm curious if you could share a little bit about where people can find you and what you have going on for you right now.
The second edition is out, 4 lessons from my 3 sons, how you can raise a resilient kid. That book and my other books on parenting, including one that I likened to Haight's book, but mine is a 1, his is 1,000, is called Your Kids Rebound from Pandemic Lockdowns, a parent guide to restoring their family. All of this is available on my website, www.nelliganbooks.com. I'm on Instagram at Nelligan_books, Facebook under Jeff Nelligan Books, and Twitter at Resilient Sons.
Love it. Okay. And just for everyone that might be having a pen in their hand right now, Nelligan is Nelligan. So you could take
Yes, sir.
all of the social medias and you could put in Nelligan. And thank you so much, Jeff, for this amazing opportunity. It's been such a pleasure with having this awesome talk with you today.
Well, one last thing. Thank you for having me, but also, thank you for what you do, because you have to, in your practice, you're dealing with parents who are coming to you, as well as children, obviously, who have some real challenges. And I'm always admire the people who do your work like you, who can listen to this and try to find a way forward for this myriad of different problems or, questions that they have, because you're the ultimate arbiter. They take it from you and then they go perform it. And, the trust is that you have it right. And so good for people like you that are trying to give parents a hand up in an age of just absolute, turmoil.
Well, thank you, Jeff, for saying that. My pushback to that would be, though, I believe that the best help that child can get is from their home, and is from parents.
Yeah.
Better
Yeah.
than me, and better than any therapist.
Oh,
And the
yeah.
therapist should not be trusted in that sense of giving that guidance, because it's really, really in the hands of the parents. And hopefully, what this podcast is doing is really helping build up within parents their own resilience regarding how to go about being a good parent. And there's no such thing as perfect
Yeah.
parenting, like we said. And
No,
I think
no.
it's something that we have to learn from, how to go about doing things to make sure that we're doing it right. But yeah, I do appreciate it, but hopefully it's the parents that shine through in everything.